Okay. Today is June the 2nd in the year 2000, and we're here to talk with Callie Dooley about her life. So we're going to be asking her some questions and giving her the opportunity to answer and to tell us about what she remembers. Okay, Callie, tell us the names of your parents and your grandparents.
My mother's name was Laura Elmina Leatherwood, or Ledford was her maiden name. Leatherwood was her married name. And my father was called Bud Leatherwood. His initials was GL, and we never knew what the L stood for. He was nicknamed Bud. But we assumed that I had an uncle way back yonder years ago that was named Luther. So we maybe surmised that his name was Luther. But I never knew him except just Bud.
Okay, that was your grandparents?
That was my mother and father.
Your mother and father, okay. And do you remember the names of your grandparents?
I do not remember the name of my grandfather. His last name was Ledford, but I can't remember what his first name was. The reason I can't remember too much about my grandparents is because the information came through my mother, and she came to Oklahoma from Georgia after she was married, and she never talked very much about her parents. But I do know that she had a stepmother, and I do not remember how many brothers and sisters she had. I know of 2 sisters that she had, and I know of 1 brother. Then there was some stepchildren, or half brothers and sisters of her mother, but I do not know what my real grandmother's, great-grandmother's name was. But the one that my grandfather had married again was named Mary. I do not remember what his first wife's name was. But anyway, she was a stepmother, and she was mean to her stepchildren. And I can remember Mama calling her, she said they all called her Old Mean Mary. Now that was the stepmother.
And you don't know anything about your father's parents?
I do know about the mother. That was my grandmother. I mean, his mother, that was my grandmother. I knew quite a bit about her, but as far as the grandfather, his name was Mark Leatherwood, but he never would let us call him Grandpa. We always called him Mark. He just would not have any of it, and not any of us ever called or knew him by Grandpa. It was always by Mark. And they lived on an adjoining farm to us, but I do not even remember him at all. I think he must have died before I was born. Of course, now in the cemetery at Stillwell are the dates of my grandfather and my grandmother, but I do not have any idea when he passed away.
Okay.
Where was that y'all lived?
Stillwell, Oklahoma.
Okay.
It was Indian Territory until 1907. Of course, you may get to this later on when I grew up. But anyway, a few years ago, the population of Adair County, where I was raised, was 97% of Indian or Indian descent. So it was Indian Territory until 1907, when it became a state of Oklahoma, 1907.
And it was your grandparents who came to Indian Territory? Is that correct?
Yes, they came first, and then my mother and father came, and we lived on adjoining farms. And the farm that my grandmother and grandfather lived on was an Indian grant. They made an Indian grant, and I have no idea what year it was that this happened, but they gave sections of land to people to come to Oklahoma to settle in Oklahoma, and it was called an Indian grant.
To white people?
Well, anyone, I guess, that wanted to come,
Right.
because there was lots of Indians, as I said, was there.
But your mother's parents were Indian, right?
No. No, my mother's parents were from Georgia, and they never came to Oklahoma.
Okay, was it your father's family that was Indian?
Well, they didn't have to be Indian to live in Oklahoma or get grant of land. They could get it. No, they were not Indian. There's a little Indian descent back in the family somewhere, but I have no idea. It's not very much. Anyway, my mother, grandmother, and grandfather were enough Indian to receive an Indian grant, but it was very little Indian blood in them.
So you did have to have some Indian blood to receive a
Yes,
grant?
right, for an Indian grant.
Oh, okay.
And Leatherwood is an Indian
An
name.
Indian name, right.
Okay. Well,
You don't happen to know what tribe of Indian, do you?
Cherokee.
Really?
Oh, definitely Cherokee. And I never heard any other tribe mentioned.
tell us about how they came on how your grandparents got there and how your parents came on the train. You told me one time about.
Now, that was my
Yes.
mother and father
Uh-huh.
that came from Georgia. I think my mother, and no, not a sister. Anyway, there was a marriage there that they married brothers. Mama married a brother, and her name was Addie. Addie. But, as I said, I was talking, there's so much of this that I don't remember, because my mother had to make a living, and we'll get into that later on, and she did not have time, and she was not a person that just dwelled on those things like that. So she talked very little of her family and her background. I know some of her background, but I do not remember these names, those things like that, because she didn't talk about it.
But your mother and father came on a train.
Okay, they came from Georgia. My mother was 17 years old when she was married. I have no idea. My father, I probably was a year or two older than she was. And they married in Georgia, and my sister, Tora, was born in Georgia. Then they came to Oklahoma.
You don't know what year they came from Georgia?
No, all of this, my nephew has this history, but I do not have it. He made a family tree, and it was very, very deep in the genealogy of people, but he has that, but I do not have.
You told me one time that they got off the train and your grandparents were waiting for them, and they took everything they had off the train, and then they went.
But in a wagon, it was moved in a freight car on the Kansas City Southern that ran from Stillwell south or whatever. But anyway, that's where my grandmother and grandfather came first and settled on this Indian grant. It was about 4 miles southwest of Stillwell. And that's where my mother and my father were headed for when they came from Georgia. And they was in a Kansas City freight train, freight car, and they had all of their household things, which was not very much, in one portion of it. And my mother has said the animals that I do not know. I don't know whether it had cow or chickens or what. It was never discussed. But anyway, my mother and father, grandmother and grandmother, met them at Dooley, Oklahoma. Was a little community settlement, and that's where the freight train let them off. And my grandmother and grandfather there was a wagon, and they had a big team of horses, and they pulled all of this, and then they went. It must have been about 4 miles from where they let them off of the train to my grandmother and grandfather's house. But it was at Dooley, and I don't know whether they moved in with my grandmother and my grandfather at first or not, but I do know that my grandmother was really a hellion of a woman. And what I mean, she was always good to me, but down through the years, she was not a real good person. And I've heard my mother tell many times after my sister Opal was born that they had to live in the house with my grandmother and my grandfather. And my grandmother had one cow, and they'd milk the cow, and she would use what milk she had, and she'd pour the milk out on the ground rather than let Opal have it to drink. Now that's the kind of a person she was. And if Opal was sleeping, she'd go out and get an armful of wood and take it in, and she'd slam it down on the floor to wake my sister up. That's the kind of woman she was. But as I said, she was always good to me, and she did not do those things while I was growing up, but that came from my mother.
This was your father's mother?
Mother and father.
Who was
Right.
mean?
Right.
Okay.
And then I do not remember when, I do not know when the grant was granted to my mother and my grandmother and grandfather, but anyway, it was a portion of land, and then they sold a portion of it to my father and my mother, and they was on an adjoining farm. And then that's where I spent my childhood, was on this adjoining farm to my mother. Now my grandfather, I do not remember him. As I said, he must have passed away before I was born, because I do not ever remember him being in and around the house. But I remember grandmother. Later on in my childhood, she was crippled and she walked with one crutch. But she would sit at the fireplace and she smoked a cob pipe, which was a common thing of that day. And she would sit by the fireplace in a rocking chair, and I've seen her reach over and take the coal out of the fireplace, put on the tobacco in her cob pipe and smoke it. But she always fixed jelly for me. She made jelly, apple jelly, but she put banana flavoring in it. But she always gave me a biscuit with that jelly on it. No, it tasted so good.
What did your father do for a living?
Well, he farmed some. That's all I know was the farm. I don't know whether he ever worked in public works or not. I do know that they lived on a farm, and they had mules, and they had cows, because my grandmother was out in the cow lot, and one cow ran over another and hit her and broke her leg, and she was crippled nearly all of the years that I knew her, and she walked with a crutch. But she could walk faster with that crutch than people did without the crutch.
Now that was your grandparents.
That was my grandmother.
But what about your father, your own father? Didn't you tell me he was a carpenter?
Yes, but we're talking about my grandfather now.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
But what about your father?
He was a carpenter. Of course, we lived on a farm, and we farmed some, but he earned wages as a carpenter.
And he farmed too. He farmed
Yes.
and did carpenter
Right,
work.
right. And I have some notebooks, notes that he had made when he was a carpenter about the wages and how much was paid to a certain person. And I've given that to Charlotte. She has it today, that where the wages were. And some of it was 5 cents an hour, and you owed so-and-so 50 cents, and wages like that. My father evidently was a good carpenter, because he built the home that we have. They lived on part of the land. They lived, when they moved to Oklahoma, they evidently must have had that house already there. That I do not know. I do know that after I was born, he started building a new house, the one that I was born in. And it was a 4-room house, and he died before it was finished. Had put 2 partial porches on it, but he had planned to put the porch all the way around the house, and he passed away before the house was finished.
You have one picture of your father, right? And
I
that,
do not have any pictures of my father. I only had one picture of him standing on the scaffolding that they were building a hotel in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, and he was standing on the scaffolding when the picture was made with the other carpenters. In the fire in 1996, it burned. And that's the only picture I had of my father at all. And it burned. I failed just to get it taken care of.
do you know how old he was when he died?
No, I don't. I was 6 months old when he died.
Do you know why he died, what he died from?
Pneumonia.
Pneumonia. When you were 6 months old.
He died in November.
Do you have any idea how old he was or how old your mother was when he died?
No, I have no idea. It's all in the family history, but I do not have it today. I do not remember.
Okay. So they had to have been married. You're the baby of the family.
Right.
And there how many children in your family?
There were 6 children in the family, but one brother died before I was born.
So they had to have been married long enough to have had 6 children
Right.
and to move from
About
Georgia.
About every 2 years they had a child. Our ages were about 2 years old. There was my sister and my brother and another, and then one was born in there, and he died when he was just a young boy. I would say 7, 8, or 9 years old, and there's a history behind that too. The reason he died, he was up at my grandmother's house, and it was cold, and he was outside playing, and there was a rain barrel there with water in it, and it had frozen over, and my brother got up in the barrel, and the ice broke, and he got soaking wet, and it was cold, and he took pneumonia and died. Now that was before I was born.
So if they had 6 children every 2 years, they probably were married at least about 15 years.
About that,
And they probably were like 16 or 17 when they married.
She was 17, and I assume that he was either 18 or 19 years old, something like that.
So he was probably in his 30s when he died.
Probably,
So he was very young when he died.
right. And my mother was left with the 5 children on the farm without any income of what that she could make on the farm. And later on, I'll tell you, she made a good living. She was a good farmer.
So how many children?
5 children.
So only one died, the one died that fell in the rain barrel, and then she had 5 children to rear, and the youngest was 6 months, and that was you.
Right, right.
And how old was the oldest? How much older was Tora than you?
Well, there was Arthur and Ralph and Opal in between there about every 2 years.
Okay, so name the children. There was
Tora. T-O-R-A, Tora, Arthur, and Ralph, and Opal, and Callie.
okay. So
So in between there, the boy that died, there will be a span of 2 years in there. So he was born after Arthur was, so there'd be a span of years between Ralph and I'd say about 4 years, something like that.
So when were you born? What was your birthday?
January the 21st, 1911.
Okay.
and so how old does that make you today?
I'll be, let's just say 89, and I'll be 90 in January the 21st of 2001.
Okay. I thought you were 89. All right. Do you know any other stories you can tell us about your childhood with what happened to you when you were a child?
Lots and lots of things happened to me when I was always into everything. I was always doing everything. I was always outside. I loved to play outside. Now, Opal, my sister, stayed in the house all the time. She never came out and played outside with us, but I was always outside. For a few years there, my brother Ralph was at home when I was growing up. Now, I played with him, and we played with the horseshoes, we played marbles, we played mumble peg, and we played, he loved horses, and we always played horses, and he would always rope me up and send me off running around the house, and We played like I was a horse for many, many years like that. This is funny. One time, we always went barefooted in the summertime, and one morning it was, I think, in the fall of the year, and it was kind of drizzling rain, and we always had a bunch of cows, and of course there was cow manure all over the cow lot out there. So one morning he said, "Sis, come out here. I want to ask you if you can do something." So he said, "I want you to walk backwards now, and don't look. Now walk backwards." And so I walked backwards, and he said, "All right." So in the walking backward, I stepped in a great big puddle of cow manure, and it had been drizzling rain, and it was as real soupy as it could be. Well, I stepped both feet in that, and I cried. I was so upset because I got my feet, because barefooted, got my feet wet and all messy. So I cried and went to the house, and my mother made him wash my feet off.
How did your mother run the farm? Did she have any hired hands, or did she?
No.
Did you just kids kind of do it yourself?
Of course not. Our older brother was at home for a while there.
So was Ralph able to like pull a
Ralph
team
was
with the
He,
plow the fields
we
with
had
the team?
a big team of horses, a great big team of dappled gray horses, and they were fine, fine horses. We never had mules. Now my father had mules, but we didn't.
Did y'all just
I only knew about the horses.
Did y'all raise one crop, or did you raise a bunch of crops?
We had wheat, and we had oats, and we had corn, and then after my father died, Mama raised what they call truck patches. She had a little bit of everything. In the meantime, my father bought real good fruit trees and set them out, and blackberries, and that was on the farm. He had real good. The Kansas City Southern Railway run through our farm. I think we had about maybe 35 acres on one side of the railroad, and the railroad split our farm, and there probably was about 30 acres on the other side of the railroad. And that was where our orchard was. There was a fine, fine orchard there. We had a real good fertile farm. It would grow anything.
What kind of fruit trees?
Apple and peach, several kinds of apples and peach and plums. Then the blackberries, great, but what they called Himalaya blackberries. You never hear that anymore. But they were great big long blackberry. And he had set out those vines before he died, and they were bearing fruit all the time. Then my mother, as I said, was a very good farmer. She could grow anything. We grew everything on the farm that we ate.
And were you able to sell some of the stuff?
That's what she did for a living.
Right.
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
We had these big two dappled horses. One of them died. Over across the railroad track in the part of the farm, there was some loose barbed wire fence. And he got tangled up in that and cut his thigh and his leg real badly. And we brought him to where we lived in the barn, and he died from that. He had an awful wound there, and we didn't have anything to cure it or anything like that. So he died. So he was left with this one, and that's the one that I knew, other than this one that died. I knew about him and seen him a lot of time, of course. But the one that was living was the one that she had to the buggy, and she went to Stillwell twice a week with all kinds of vegetables, and we always had a bunch of cows. And she made wonderful butter. And I have churned 1,000,000 pounds of butter in that churn. And that's the way she made a living. She had regular customers. And then if she had extra, well, she would sell it. And that's the way we got. My mother was a good farmer. She made a good living. And back to my mother. My mother had no education. She could not read or write. She could read print, but she could not read writing, or she could not write. She said when she was a kid going to school back in Georgia, she was shy and she would make a mistake, and the kids would laugh at her, and she just quit going to school. And that's the reason that she did. But now she could read print. But now she was a good accountant too, I'm telling you. And the way she would count, if it was 10, 12, something like that, she'd say 10 and 10 makes 20, and 2 left over is 22, and if there's 4 left over, 24. That's the way she counted. She never made a mistake. And that's the way she counted up the money that she had.
So she really couldn't plow the land with a team of horses, but so she went to smaller areas of crops. Then
Yes, right. But now we did have wheat field, and we did have oats. Mostly wheat was what I know about, and we did have corn. And we would take the wheat. There was a mill in Stillwell. We lived, as I said, 4 miles southwest of Stillwell. And she would take the wheat. At that time, neighbors helped each other. Everybody nearly in that area had wheat fields. They had a thresher, and the different men in the community would go with that thresher to one place farm, wheat field, and they would cut that wheat, and then they would move on to somebody else's field. At one time, they cut our wheat, and we didn't have a place to store it, couldn't store it in the barn. We did have a barn, so we piled it in one corner of the bedroom until she could take it to town to mill and have it ground, and that's the way we got our flour. We had a cornfield, and we took the wagon or buggy and picked the corn, take it, shuck it, put it in the barn, and then take it to the mill and grind it, and that's the way we had cornmeal. Flour and cornmeal.
so mainly those you just did for yourself. You didn't sell the wheat or the
No,
corn.
no. We just kept it. The miller would, we never had to pay for it because he would take part of the wheat as his payment for grinding it.
And so you remember your brother being at home, but mainly Opal was the sibling that you.
My mother and Opal and I grew up together. I can remember my older brother being there a while, but during the First World War, I can remember him coming out from town. He worked in the telephone company in Stillwell, and he came out and told us goodbye. He rode a bicycle out as he was going into the service. And then my brother stayed for a while, and I don't like to say this.
You don't have to say it.
Well, it goes in there.
Okay.
My brother was what we would call the black sheep of the family. He was very rude. He did not want to obey my mother. And he and my brother had a fight one time after my brother was married and came out to the farm to live. He had a fight, and after that fight, he left, and then he was never at home anymore.
Was this Arthur?
We know this was Ralph.
Ralph.
I know very little about him, but I do know that there was a number of things that we knew about him that at that time, if you was not like you ought to be, and he was. I don't know a word to call him, but anyway, he was not an outlaw. As far as I know, he was never did anything unlawful or anything like that. But anyway, he went to Colorado and worked on a cattle farm, a big ranch for years. But there's very little I know about that. But anyway, he never go to church, and he didn't want to obey my mother, and he was mean to the stock, and he didn't want to do on the farm. He didn't want to work anything like that, and so he left. Now that's about all I know. At one time, I don't know, he must have been 17 or 18 years or so like that. Maybe a little bit older than that when he left. And I know very little. I had never seen him another time after that, and he died in 1940. He died in February. Paul was born in January, and he died in February, which was 1940. So I had never seen him from that time. One time, he came through with a friend of his to Tulsa, and I was working in Tulsa, and he came to the J.C. Penney company where I was working, and I was out to lunch, and I did not get to see him, so I never saw him after he left home.
That was Ralph.
Right.
And Arthur was already married, and he married Isabel?
Elizabeth.
Lizabel.
No, he was not married at that time because he worked in the telephone office for a long time, and then he went into the service, and it was after he came out of the service that he was married.
Okay. Did he still live at home when he worked for the telephone company?
No, he lived in Stillwell.
Okay.
And my sister Tora worked for the telephone company. At that time, there was one of those switchboards that they had. There was a great big wall there, and they had these lines that went in, the numbered lines went in there, and when anybody would call in and wanted to call somebody else, they picked that up and punched that in there. That was the telephone system. And my brother worked there for a long time, and my sister, Tora, worked there.
Did Tora ever marry?
Oh yes, oh yes.
Who did she marry?
Leroy Martin. They were living in Fort Smith at the time. Now, I don't remember whether she evidently was working in Fort Smith, because I do know she came to while I was still living on the farm.
Did she have children?
One child, Gwendolyn. You remember Gwendolyn?
Right.
Okay, she
Right.
lives in St. Louis, and you know I have not heard from her over 4 years, 3 years, 3 years.
And then Arthur and Lizabel, and did they have children?
Yes. A.K., or the Art that we know, his father was Arthur, mother was Lizabel. And then they had one other son, 14 years between their ages, and named Gale. And he lives in Sacramento, California today. And he's the one that has the family history, that has the genealogy. He's real deep into it. He's gone way back yonder for everybody.
Okay. And then if Ralph had children, you don't, did he never married?
Married with, that we knew of. When he died, we got a letter from Ella, and she said that they had married, but he never told us about it, but I'm sure that they lived together. Now, whether they were married or not, I do not know. But anyway, she wrote, and I told about him, that they had lived together, and she gave her part of the Social Security. You know, you draw so much money whenever you die, Social Security. So she sent Mama and Opal his portion of Social Security, but I never knew her. Her name was Ella, and that's about all I know about her. That was in Colorado.
And Opal never married?
No. And let me tell you about Ralph's wife, Ella, I'll say wife. When Art, or A.K., was in the service, he was in Washington, and a fellow there in a uniform was talking and this, that, and the other. And Arthur found out his name was Leatherwood, went under the name of Leatherwood, and it come out that he was the son of Ralph's wife, Ella. But now we never knew about that, see. We never knew she had any children or anything like that. But Arthur didn't pursue it any farther or anything like that, but he just knew that Ralph was his stepfather as such.
Tell us the story about, was it your brother that was taking a trip and died on the train? And
That was an uncle.
your uncle.
That was an uncle, a son of my grandmother and grandfather. And now this was, well, all this had happened, and my grandmother had passed away, my uncle was still living on the farm, and he was going, his name was Bob, I guess Robert, but anyway we always knew him as, and we never called him uncle or aunt, but we knew that they were uncle and aunt. But we never called him uncle, but it was my uncle. And he was coming into Texas. I think it was Jefferson, where he was going, Jefferson, Texas. While he was on the bus, he got sick. They took him off of the bus, and from then on we know nothing about the history. We have no idea where he's buried. I'm sure that whatever town it was, don't know whether he even got to Jefferson or not. Because see, there was nobody, no corresponding or anything like that back then. My grandmother was gone, my aunt was gone, his sister was gone, so, and we were in Stillwell, and we had no contact with them at all. So that's the reason that so much of this history is just blank.
But he was taking this trip and he got sick and he died and someone buried him somewhere along the way, and,
Right.
and the family doesn't know
Right.
why he died or where he's
We
buried.
have any idea where he's buried. It's somewhere in Texas.
He just went on this trip and disappeared forever. But, okay. Well, tell us about you and your schooling. Where did you go to school?
Well, I was past 6 years old when I started to school. I think I was 6 in January and I started to school in August. School started in August. And by the way, we always had a 9-month school. We never missed a day out of school to help on the farm or work or anything like that. My mother just wasn't necessary that we do that. Now, most of the kids, I don't know whether they still do it or not, but they quit school for 2 or 3 months during harvesting time, when the kids had to stay home and help on the farm, do those things like that. But never. I had a full 9 months of school, all of my school life.
This was in Stillwell?
Yes,
Okay.
in Stillwell. About, the school was a mile from where we lived.
How'd you get there?
Walked. There was no other way. And we seldom ever missed, I cannot remember staying out of school on account of the weather. And I was sick. I was healthy and played out all the time and things like that. But I did have real bad colds. And it just almost went into pneumonia every time. And I've had it several since that time. It almost went into pneumonia. But that was the only time that I was ever sick. Hardly ever missed a day out of school because I was sick or because of the weather. And when I was growing up, we didn't know what galoshes or shoes to wear during weather. We knew nothing about that. And when it snowed, and it snowed a lot during my childhood, it snowed a lot in Oklahoma, we would take heavy men's socks and put over our shoes to keep the snow off of our shoes. And then when we got to school, we'd pull the socks off. We didn't have anything to protect our shoes.
Did you like school?
Yes, that was about the only activity, and didn't ever think about not going to school. No, and my mother was a staunch believer, as long as she lived, in education, because she didn't have an education. But she saw it that nothing got in the way of her kids getting an education.
How far did you go in school?
Well, we graduated out of the country school at 8th grade. And then we went to high school in Stillwell for 4 years and graduated. And when I graduated from high school, we only had to have 16 credits. each year.
That was very unusual back then for anyone to finish high school, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Can you remember how many were in your class that graduated together?
At 36 when I graduated from high school, but there's only 2 or 3 of them that's living today.
But there were 36. That's a good
Right,
number.
Right,
For,
it's a good number.
for as small a place as Stillwell, and that many years ago, that was a good number.
Right. I graduated in 1929.
Tell us the story about the time you got held back in school.
Stayed in the same grade, 6th grade, 2 years. Opal was she was really 2 grades ahead of me. But then when I had to stay under that, she was about a year ahead of me. And then we had a woman teacher come out from Stillwell, and I do not remember whether she had a car at that time or not. I do not remember how she got to school, because she lived in Stillwell and the school was about 4 or 5 miles out in the country, because we were 4 miles and the school was a mile the other direction, so about 5 miles. And she brought her daughter with her. And one evening when school was out, well, everybody was getting ready to leave, and everybody was leaving, and so the daughter of the school teacher was swinging in the aisle, and I couldn't get by, and each person had a desk at that time, and she was standing in the middle of the aisle, and she had her hands out where I couldn't get by, and I couldn't get by, so I wanted by, and I didn't do a thing but just double up my fist and give her a real hard biff in the stomach. Bent her over all right. Cried, you thought I had killed her, and her mother ran and loved her and hugged her up and all like that. And because of that incident, that teacher held that against me, and she did not pass me out of the 6th grade, and I had to stay in the 6th grade 2 years simply because of that, because it was not my grades that I couldn't have passed.
Was she your teacher the next year? Do you remember?
Yeah, I suppose so. But
So-
I had several teachers during that 8 years.
So you had to go back and face the same grade again with the same teacher just because you whacked her daughter in the stomach.
Right.
Well, what did you dream of doing with your life when you were in school? What did you think you would do?
I can't remember even thinking, what the future would be. You just took it as it came. When we were still living on the farm while we were going to school, and when Opal graduated out of the 8th grade and started the high school in Stillwell, there were several well, 3 or 4 in the same community went to high school, and they walked. And then I've gotten into this. My mother married a man while Opal was in high school. Cut that thing off a minute, can you?
Yeah.
Am I supposed to tell all of these things? The newspaper got a hold of her where she had made the living, paid all the bills and everything like that, and she had $100 in cash. A man in Stillwell got the idea, put it in the newspaper. Then my mother had suitors calling, because that was something that was very unusual for a widow woman to have a farm and to have that much money. It didn't last very long. She got a divorce, and he was from Arkansas, and went back to Arkansas, and he's buried at Siloam Springs, Arkansas. He had two sons. One of them worked for Lifesavers Candy Company for a long time, and one of them was a graduate of West Point Academy.
Okay, let's talk about Jim and how you met him and where you were married.
Jim grew up in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, which was 25 miles from Stillwell. He grew up on a farm with 6 children in the family, and I met him in Tulsa. I had graduated from high school and gone to work for J.C. Penney Company and lived at the YWCA. And when I lived at the YWCA, got to going to the First Baptist Church in Tulsa, and that's where I met Jim. There was quite a group of young people along about our age that were going there.
What do you know about his family?
There were 6 children in the family, 3 boys and 3 girls, and they lived on a farm, and they were sick most of the life that I knew about his family. Both of them were sick. His mother and his father was sick.
Can you name his brothers and sisters?
Bill, Dosha was the oldest. Dosha, Bill, Ola Mae, Leonard, Ed, and Bernice.
And where did Jim come in there?
He came in there. There was Bill, Jim, and Leonard then. Then Ed and Hugh.
So he was the fourth one in the family? There was,
Yeah, he was a fourth. Dosha, then Bill, and then Jim. A third one, I guess. Third one.
okay. And tell us the story about his heart problem. When he was a child, didn't the
About 12 years old. Now this come from his mother after I was in the family. The old doctor, I don't know what his ailments was, but anyway, he would have been an invalid if I had to pay attention to his ailments after we were married. He would have been an invalid. But anyway, old doctor told him that he had a murmur of the heart, and that they had to treat him real careful and never get him excited or discipline real heavy or any of those things like that would cause problems with his heart. He grew up believing that he was the king of the walk, and he wasn't supposed to be reprimanded, he wasn't supposed to be Spanished anyway. The kids were supposed to wait on him and this, that, and the other. He grew up like that.
what did they do for a living?
Well, made ties. That's another story.
What kind of ties?
Railroad ties that the rails are put on the railroad, meager living. They lived way back in the hills of Sallisaw, and my mother-in-law stayed on that farm 2 years, never left the farm, never left I don't think they had very much of a farm.
So they tried to raise their own food and make
Well,
these.
they never lived on a place where there was very much acreage to make a living.
Oh. And they made railroad ties.
He made railroad ties and hauled them into town.
Did he go to school?
I know nothing about it.
Jim?
Oh, I thought you were talking about his father and his mother.
Oh, okay. About Jim, where did he go to school?
Well, he went to school, country school in Sallisaw. They had way out in the boondocks. They had country school, and he went to school there. But then they moved to western Oklahoma, and he didn't go to school there anymore. And
How high did he go in school?
in the country school, I don't even know whether he went through the 8th grade or not. But he never had any high school training at all. He never went to high school.
Okay.
When we were married, we lived in Missouri. He went to Bolivar Baptist School and took a GED test, is that what you call it? And took a test and passed it and got a high school certificate.
Okay. And so he was working in Tulsa, and you met in Tulsa, and you were married there in Tulsa?
Yes, I was living at the YWCA. The YWCA provided the wedding for me. And the pastor of the First Baptist Church, Dr. J.W. Storr, was the pastor. He came and performed the ceremony. My Sunday school teacher sang, and I had on a long blue dress, real pretty dress. I had a jacket on it, tied in front. I had a new pair of black shoes and a little black turban hat. We were married on Sunday afternoon,
And when was that?
1934. November the 18th, 1934.
And after that, where did you live, and what did you do?
We lived in Tulsa. I worked for the J.C. Penney Company, and we lived on 6th Street, and we moved 4 times while we were living in Tulsa.
And where did you go after Tulsa? Tell us all the places that you've lived in.
Jim was working in a creamery, Glencliff Creamery, and supporting his family. Bill had left and gone to Ada, Oklahoma, and he was not helping with the farm. The rest of the kids were still there in high school. They all graduated from high school in Tulsa.
He was supporting his family, and then he married you. And
Yeah,
what
right.
happened when you left Tulsa, what'd you do next?
And I think I was making maybe $100 a month working at Penny's, and he was working for the creamery. And I married him under those circumstances with that little salary, with his family to support. But it was love. It was love. We had a wonderful time together, even as teenagers and at church, at school. We had, I don't mean school, I mean at church. We had a good time. Had lots of fun.
And when did he decide to go into the ministry?
Oh, that's another story. I've got to hurry, haven't I?
Keep going.
He was working for the creamery, and he got a better job with the Jenkins Music Company as credit manager. He was not there too long until they transferred him to Joplin, Missouri, because a man had embezzled thousands of dollars from the credit in the Jenkins Music Company. He went there to take over that, and he worked day and night. And we moved from Tulsa to Joplin, which is an old town. They burn coal all the time, and it was in the wintertime. Snow on the ground, and he was working night and day. I didn't know anybody, and I left him. I went back to Tulsa, and but after that, then it was all right. I went back and lived in Tulsa. I mean, Joplin. Had a real good time in Joplin because the same group of young people were married now, and none of us had any money, but we had a wonderful time together. One fellow worked for Hershey's Candy Company, and one person worked for a cracker company, bakery, I guess. Anyway, he had graham crackers, and we would meet after church. A bunch of us would meet at some place, apartment or house. Most of us lived in houses, apartments, anyway. And we would, for our snacks and everything, and we just enjoyed them much. We'd take marshmallows and melt them, and take the Hershey's chocolate squares and put them in the graham cracker, then put the melted marshmallows on top of that, and oh, it made a real good sandwich. Now, we enjoyed doing that. That was one of the things that was outstanding and with the group that was growing up together.
Now, in Missouri, that was when he decided to go into the ministry?
No? Well, it was in Missouri, but was not that at that time. Then we moved from Joplin to Springfield, Missouri. He worked for the penal institution at a federal prison, and I do not remember how long he was there. And we met some friends in Joplin, Missouri, and his early years had been in Indiana. He and his wife went back to Indiana. We were good friends down through all of their lives, or his life. He went back to Indiana. So then he and Jim decided that they were going to farm together. Orville James was a farmer and a carpenter. But anyway, they decided they would go out together and rent a farm, and we would farm this farm. In Indiana, have huge farms. Most of it is corn and soybeans. So we lived with them for about 2 months. And during that time, they were looking for a farm to go live on. It didn't work out. So we heard of this place in Missouri, back in Missouri. And by the way, I want to tell too, we moved to Indiana while the war was on, and Paul was about, not in school yet, he was about 5 years old, I think, 4 or 5 years old. So Jim went to Indiana to work in the penal institution there, or the prison there, and then Paul and I went to him to live in Terre Haute, Indiana for a while. But that was during the war, and we went on the Kansas City Southern, and when we got on the train, it absolutely was loaded with men in service, soldiers, and there was no room for them. They slept up and down the aisles, and they crowded in 3 or 4 in a seat. Now that was during the war, and that's the way we went to Terre Haute. I remember one time we was there, and there was no seats on there, but the conductor managed to find me a seat, and Paul was going to sit beside me, so the conductor came in and said I'd have to hold him. Well, lo and behold, I put him up in my lap, and here came a woman with 5 kids. And they rode in the same seat with us, but crowded like that. Then we rented this farm in Cedar Creek, Missouri. That is 4 or 5 miles in one direction from Neosho, Missouri. We leased a farm there. We had a herd of cows, and we had hogs and horses, and a big, big garden. While I was there, I canned 600 jars of vegetables and fruit while we were living on that. Then we went to Carl Junction, Missouri. He bought a place in Carl Junction, Missouri. I wish I had time to describe that house that I had to live in. It was 2 rooms and 1 little room built on the side of that. That absolutely was the filthiest house that I have ever. I think people must have lived with hogs in that house. It took us several days for the 2 neighbors in Cedar Creek to go with me. We'd have to drive several miles from Cedar Creek to Carl Junction to clean it up. And it like to not a drop of paint on it. And of course it was, didn't even think about anything being modern or anything like that.
How long did you live there in that house?
We lived in Carl Junction, no electricity, no telephone.
No bathroom.
Well, of course, no bathroom. And we lived there. I can't remember. I was pregnant while we lived there, and I had a miscarriage. Cold, cold night, and we had to leave Paul with some neighbors and go into Joplin Hospital, which was about 5 or 6 miles, or so, I don't know, farther than that. But that's where I had the miscarriage. Then I lived there, and then I got pregnant. I don't know how many years we lived there, but anyway, I came pregnant again. And it was while I was pregnant that Jim decided that the Lord was calling him into the ministry. And he felt like that the Lord had been calling for a long, long time. He just did not respond. He even, when we were living in Tulsa, he even went to Dr. Storr and talked to him about it. At that time, he had his family to support, or was still helping with his family, and Dr. Storr told him it was better to be a good, conscious Christian layman than it would to be going into the ministry. But that did not give him any rest, and we went back. He went back with it. Then the call still worried him. We had a big bunch of milk cows. We had one big, fine Jersey cow, the best one, I guess, of the whole herd. And it was cold, and he went out one morning to do up the chores, and then came back in the house. He fed the cows, and the cows were all right this that, and the other. He came back in the house to warm a little bit, went back out to the barn, and the fine Jersey cow was dead. He got down on his knees, and there he said, "Lord, I'm going to preach. I'll go into the ministry because I feel like God, you're going to take every one of my cows if I don't." So that right. Then we moved to a little place called Split Log. Post office, a store, big grocery store, post office, filling station, and one church. And that's where, that was Split Log. And that's where Charlotte was born. And he pastored that church. The people there were wonderful to us. Well, they were good to their preacher. And they loved him. And he had a good minister there, but then he felt like he was needed somewhere else. In all of his ministry, he never felt like that because of some fuss in the Baptist church or disagreement, thing like that, he had to leave. It never happened. In all the churches that he pastored, we could go back today and have the same good friendship that we had when he was there. Then he went to Newtonia.
Did you ever count up how many places he pastored?
I did it one time, and I think it was 23.
23.
I have it down here on the list, and I was gonna get it while ago and mention the places. I could do that now. if
Well,
you
we're
want.
going to run out of time
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
I wanted to ask
2
you,
minutes.
what do you think is your greatest success in life?
Raising 2 wonderful children.
And what do you most want to be remembered by?
A happy Christian, outgoing,
And do you have any advice?
loving,
Yeah.
living person.
Do you have any advice for us?
Well, live a good, clean, honest Christian life to your best ability.
Well, we thank you for telling us these stories today. I know we could go on, but these were the highlights of your life,
Yeah.
and we appreciate your
It was
talking.
quite interesting. Of course, there's lots and lots left out of it, but I was a loving person. I like people. I love my children, and I'm proud of them.
Well, I'd say that the greatest gift the Lord ever gave you and that you passed on to us was your gift of encouragement. You always knew how to encourage us when we...
Good. Because I never let obstacles get in my way. I blazed my way through it.
So you're a strong person.
I went into the church, Baptist church in Stillwell, Oklahoma, when I was 16 years old. My mother was a wonderful praying Christian. I would not be what I am today if it had not been for her prayers. Can never remember a night going by, even when we lived on the farm, that my mother did not pray and pray for us. So I grew up that. So I went into the church. She came, we were having a revival. She came to me and she had tears in her eyes. My mother never cried. And she wanted me to become a Christian, join the church. I went down with no change whatsoever. And when we were baptized, the church did not have a baptistry at that time. Or they had a baptistry, but they did not have any dressing rooms or anything. So we went across to the next building from where the church was, went into the next building, a big old 2-story house that was vacant, and it was so cold, and our clothes was wet coming out of the baptistry. Our clothes froze on us from the time we went to the church into this big building. None of us ever had a cold or anything like that. And then after Charlotte was a baby, Paul had already made a profession.